Hi there, I'm Joshua Hanlon from the Beyond the Brick YouTube channel at the Tank Museum, Bovington. I travel all around the world interviewing some of the world's most talented LEGO builders, including some of the most skilled LEGO military builders in the world. Today I'm going to be showing you my top 5 favorite military vehicles here at the Tank Museum.
Hey Josh.
Hey Dan.
Trying to save your failing YouTube channel by coming to the best museum in the world.
I figure it couldn't hurt. Let's take a look at my top 5. At number 5 for me is the Mark 8 or the International. One of the things I love about coming to a place like the Tank Museum is seeing how tanks and armored vehicles provide kind of physical examples of technological progress throughout a war. And I think the Mark 8 is a great example of that. This is really the culmination of everything that had been learned about tank design throughout the First World War. And it was called the International because it was actually a joint design between the English and the Americans, and then it was going to be built at a factory in France. And so it was these Allied powers using everything they had learned to create the best tank possible. And it's such an incredible tank to see here in person at the museum. It's massive length. It could fit 8 crew members, so you had to have a lot of room in there for guys to move around. But it had to be that long because they were trying to span trenches with this. That was the strategy you see with a lot of these First World War tanks. And so seeing this in person at the museum is just so amazing because you see how all of that technology culminated in the end of the war. And though these didn't actually serve during the war, you can still see where all of the best engineering went as we progressed. Behind me now is number 4 on my list, the Tiger 1. And this is such an incredible, beautiful, imposing tank here. And it's really the Mona Lisa of the Tank Museum collection. And I love that they have this central piece that people can come in and look forward to seeing among all of the other incredible tanks on display here at the museum. I also particularly love this tank because the Tiger 1 is featured prominently in one of my all-time favorite movies, Kelly's Heroes, which is just a fantastic war movie. If you haven't seen that before, I definitely encourage you to grab some friends, sit down and watch Kelly's Heroes because it's a great time and really shows the Tiger 1 very nicely. It's actually pretty accurate compared to the way that German tanks have been depicted in a lot of war films over the years, so they did a good job with that as well. But that's why the Tiger 1 is number 4 on my list. At number 3 on my list is the Praying Mantis, and this vehicle is just such a wonderful example of what happens when you combine imagination with mechanical engineering to try to come up with a new type of fighting vehicle. And the idea of this is pretty simple. Basically, it's got a super low profile, and then this middle section here would actually pop up, and so that way you could have the main part of the vehicle protected down low to the ground, and then this section would pop up. You'd have 2 crew members inside here and 2 machine guns on top, and that would be the weaponry on the vehicle. And so the idea was you could maybe come up to a wall, the bottom part of the vehicle would be protected, and then the machine guns would pop up and be able to shoot over a wall. In practice, it didn't work quite so well. The crew members in there, it was very difficult to move around and have a good line of sight. They were bounced around quite a bit as the vehicle was driving to the point where they were even getting sick inside there. And so it never actually saw combat. But I just think it's such a great example of the types of new ideas that are brought into combat during a conflict when people are trying to come up with any new idea that might give their side an edge against the enemy. And that's why it's number 3 on my list. Coming in at number 2 on my list is the Sherman 5 Crab tank, or the flail tank. And it's known as the flail because chains would be attached to all of these spots on the front here, and when the tank was running, those chains would be running rapidly, trying to clear mines out in front of it. And much like the Praying Mantis, I like this vehicle because it's a twist or a different idea on a more traditional fighting vehicle. So most people are familiar with the Sherman tank that this is attached to, but when you added this round section and added the chains at the front, all of a sudden you could create a very effective mine clearing vehicle. And the men who served in these actually had quite a difficult task ahead of them because they were on the front lines moving rather slowly, clearing these mines for the troops behind them as the enemy was shooting at their tanks. And because of that, there would often be tanks nearby them trying to provide fire support. But it's just another great example of the way that traditional fighting vehicles can be adapted for whatever the need is at the time. As wars continue and progress, the troops on the ground and the designers can come up with new ways to use a fighting vehicle. And that's why I have it at number 2 on my list. Now we're in front of my number 1 favorite tank here at the museum. This is the M48 Patton tank. These are particularly interesting because they were sent all over the world from the US during the Cold War, and so you find these in many different places. You'll find these in Vietnam, in Cairo, that the Egyptians captured from the Israelis, and so it's really interesting just to see how these tanks were used throughout the Cold War by where you find them located in museums throughout the world. But as I mentioned, Vietnam is probably where this tank is most famous for being used, and so it had some great features that were super useful. One of those was its defense against mines. The bottom of this tank is actually almost shaped like a boat hull, and so because of that, it was really powerful against mines and had a great defense. The men inside could generally stay pretty safe if a mine went off underneath the tank. They would actually do like thunder runs with these tanks where they would line a couple up next to each other, race them down a road to a spot a mile or two away, and try to set off as many mines as possible to clear a path for the infantry coming behind these tanks in Vietnam. It's also a very forgotten part of Vietnam just because of the fame of things like the Huey helicopter and the armored personnel carriers, and so I've seen interviews where Vietnam veterans who served on these tanks will tell someone that they served on a tank in Vietnam, and people didn't even realize that there were tanks that were in Vietnam, and so it's often overlooked part of the war, but there were hundreds of these serving all throughout Vietnam during the war, and so it's a really interesting part of the conflict because of that. There were also all sorts of add-ons that the troops would do as rocket-propelled grenades became more popular. Troops would throw sandbags and whatever they could find on the side of these tanks just to really add extra armor, track links, things like that, just to really beef up that defense and help support against the enemy troops. So I love this tank because you see it all over the world, and it has a fascinating yet often overlooked history during the Vietnam War. That's why it's my number one. Thank you so much to the Tank Museum for letting me come in today and show you my top 5 vehicles here at the museum. Make sure to subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel and support them on Patreon to allow them to continue to preserve this amazing collection.